I wanted to share with you some of the landscapes that Frederick Douglass has walked through. And first of all, I would like to give you the story of his ascendancy into the abolitionist scenario, starting off in 1859 when he was being pursued by U.S. Marshals. So as you know, if you've all read the local newspapers, on October 16th, 1859, a small band of men staged an attack upon Harper's Ferry, Virginia. They did so in order to seize the armaments from the U.S. arsenal, and they were going to distribute these armaments amongst the slaves who were going to, according to them, revolt against slavery. The man who led this insurrection, John Brown, is a man who had talked with me for years about helping relieve the burden of slavery on my oppressed brethren, the sable black folk of this country called the United States of America. Well, he had come to me and said he wanted to lead them up into the mountains into Canada. But he had changed his mind, and he said he was going to attack the slave system full force, head on, because there was no longer any time to wait for slavery to end. We had to act now. We had to act forcefully, and we had to act with revolutionary zeal. I looked at John Brown, and I said to him, "You are going to be walking into a powder keg, and it's going to blow up all around you." And indeed, John Brown and his men walked into that Harper's Ferry armament and was surrounded by soldiers on every side. Some were killed, and John Brown was taken into custody, and John Brown was court-martialed, called a traitor, and said he was going to be hung until dead. On his way to the gallows, they asked John Brown what his final statement would be. And John Brown looked at everyone with clear, sharp eyes as though he were going to heaven and said, "I do believe that the sins of this country are so great that they will not be purged except they be washed in blood." This was John Brown's premonition. This was John Brown's admonition about what was about to take place in our country. John Brown has become the premonition that thousands of men will lay down their lives to defeat this God-forsaken system of slavery. And I, too, as a former slave, I, too, have become a premonition. You know what it is that the slave master hates more than anything else in the world? He hates for someone such as myself to steal myself away. That is, to steal his property and take it to freedom. So the slave master hates that so much that they turn over in their grave when they hear somebody running away from them. But what not only do they hate and turn over in their grave about, what actually makes their bodies just sink into decay is when a former slave such as myself tells the truth about slavery, speaks out against its inhumanity that is perpetrated against all human beings on the face of the earth, especially our black brethren. Do you know what this ignominious creed of slavery purports to exalt in this world? In order for one man to enslave another, he must fight desperately day and night to keep that other human being ignorant of his humanity. He must make that other person ignorant of his humanity in order to gain his goals of supremacy against that human being. And when you try to destroy the humanity of another human being, you destroy your own. This is the truth that slave masters hate to hear, as though their whole body were being boiled in oil. But when I was a young boy, I had no notion of what slavery was. I was protected from the God-forsaken system of slavery, at least consciously. My first memories of my grandmother Betsy. She used to put her waist deep in the water, and she used to throw her nets out in the water. They called it seine hauling. You all heard of that expression? Where your nets go straight out over the water, and she would sing a wonderful melody. The waters of Jordan are flowing to Zion, flowing home. To my Lord, the waters of Jordan are flowing to Zion, flowing home. To my Lord. Yes, my Grandma Betsy was a famous fishing woman in those parts. She was also a famous planting woman. They'd say that no seed would go into the ground unless Grandma Betsy's hands were touching that seed. She had magic hands. Everything she touched sprouted and grew. But one day, my Grandma Betsy said to me, she said, "Fred, you see the little hut we live in over here, don't you? And you see all these youngins that I take care after, including yourself and including myself. You see us, don't you? And you see how the land stretches for miles in this direction and miles in that direction? All of this property, and we, people here, we belong to old Massa," she said. And she said it with a sense of joy, reverence in her voice. And so I thought she was talking about the master of the universe, the old master. Little did I know she was talking about a human being who had very little properties that were similar to the Almighty. So she said to me, "Fred, I want to take you to meet your kinfolk up at the main plantation." And so we walked for about 10 miles barefoot, as we always did. It was always barefoot. I thought I saw a lion coming. She said, "That ain't no lion, Fred. That's just an old tree stump." I said, "Grandma, that is a lion." She said, "No, let's go and see it." She dragged me screaming and kicking. And she said, "Yes, look at that. That ain't no lion." I said, "Yes, you're right, but I'm scared as hell. And please pick me up." And so she picked me up and she put me on her shoulders. And you wouldn't know that my grandma was an older woman.
Oh, wow.
You know, you wouldn't know that she was 875, picking a little old strapping boy up me, a boy like me, and putting her on her shoulders. And she walked with me for I don't know how long. If you saw the little white hairs coming down out of her scarf, then you'd know that she was a little bit older than what you can see. But she looked like she was a spring chicken, let me tell you. So at the main plantation, she said, "Look, there's all your kinfolk." I said, "Let me down, I feel great." She said, "You should be. I just walked with you for 5 miles on my shoulders. I can't tell how I'm feeling right now, but you must be feeling great, I can see that. I think you should go play with your kinfolk." And I looked at the kinfolk. She says, "There's your brother Perry, there's your sister Liza, there's your cousin Jethro." She started naming all these folk. The light-skinned ones, the white-looking ones, the dark black ones. They were all my kinfolk. She said, "Go play with them." I said, "They're wild. They're too wild for me." She said, "Go play with them. Get you away from my petticoats." So I went to play with these kinfolk, and they certainly were a wild bunch. But before long, I realized that my grandma was nowhere in sight. And then one of my cousins comes skipping up to me and says, "Fred, your grandmama's gone." What do you mean she's gone? Right? As soon as I thought that she was gone, someone tells me she's gone. Is that premonition or what? I went out to the front and called Grandma in every direction, in every direction. I could not find her. My brother Perry, the boy that I just met, he come up behind me and said, "Here's a peach and a pear." And I took both peach and pear and threw it as far as I could. I didn't want no peach and pear. I wanted my grandma. He said, "The reason your grandma left you here and disappeared is because you, like one of us, all of us, we're slaves. And we belong to old Massa." And that was the first time that I realized in my life that I was a slave, which meant that you could take me from my grandma and I was powerless to do anything about it. That is a powerful sentiment to a young mind, and I cried like a fine fella. They took me to the kitchen where I was placed in a room with all the young boys. There were 15 young boys. I was the 16th. And we stayed in that kitchen, we played in that kitchen, we worked in that kitchen, and the woman who ran that kitchen, Aunt Katie, took a special disliking to me. At one point in my life on this plantation, I had been hurt really badly, and I came to Aunt Katie, and she said, serves you right, messing around with them other slaves, and she just rolled her eyes and walked away from me. And then another point, she cut up 16 pieces of cornbread, and she gave them out to all the boys except me. And then when she looked at me and rolled her eyes and went out with my piece of cornbread, I went out after her thinking what she's gonna do. And she gave it to the chickens. And she looked at me and said, I hope you starve. And I realized that Aunt Katie was probably the meanest woman I had ever known. This was a turning point in my life, like all the times in my life when I tell you this story. That very same evening, a person appeared on the plantation. I was looking for some food because I was starving by then in the corners of the kitchen, and I found some corn kernels, and I was putting them in the hot coals of the oven. And this person who came into the room startled me. I thought it was Aunt Katie at first, but it wasn't. It was someone I haven't even told you about. It was my very own mother. She had been farmed out. You know what that means? That means that she'd been hired out to other farmers, which means that she and her 4 or 5 sisters were always at other places instead of with their own families. And so that's the way the slave master keeps people from bonding with each other, makes families unprotected from each other. But here had come my mother. Hadn't seen her for maybe a couple of years, and she walks into the room. She says, Fred, you look pale and sickly. And I told her what Aunt Katie had said to me. She said, I hope you starve. Well, my mother went into her room, Aunt Katie's room, woke her up out of a dead sleep, and gave her a report, the likes of which would make your ears fall off if I would tell you all the words she said to that woman. Something to the effect, don't you ever let me hear you saying this to my son again, because if I were to die this very night, I would come back and haunt you. Y'all can hear me, can't y'all? Everybody can hear me now? Thank you. So I heard her say those words, I'd come back and haunt you, and I could hear the wind being knocked out of Aunt Katie like someone had hit her in the chest. She was afraid. People were afraid of spirits and ghosts. People were superstitious, if you want to call it that. And that time, after that time, my mother, she walked out of that room. She fixed a big dish of gingerbread for me. And then I don't know where she got all these ingredients from, but she cooked it up, and she boiled some milk, and she sat me down, and she prayed over me, and sang with me, and sang to me, and put me to sleep. I felt like I was saved from the jaws of the lion. Aunt Katie never did do another really, really nasty thing to me after that. I think she was scared out of her life. But if someone treats you mean, there's always someone in your life that's going to treat you kindly. And Miss Lucretia, the master's daughter, was a woman who treated me very, very kindly. And she decided that since I was growing up to be one of the field hands, that I had another fate to offer the world. So she sent me to Baltimore. In retrospect, if I were to be telling you this story, Miss Lucretia was actually my half-sister. At the time, I did not know it, but we had the same father. So they sent me to Baltimore, and I became, I guess you could say I became the babysitter of the family there, Mr. Hewald and his wife, Sophia. And when I came to the house in Baltimore, I knocked on the door, and I put my head down to keep my eyes away from looking into the eyes of a white person, because you were inculcated not to look at a white person directly, because if you did, that meant you were equal to them. But the lady who came to that door, she picked my head up, and she said, "Don't you put your head down, son. You have beautiful eyes." I thought I was looking into the eyes of an angel. Her calmness, her peacefulness was so beautiful to me. And she accepted me into her home, and she taught me the rudiments of reading. One day I was sitting next to her. She and her boy, Tommy, were sitting there, and I was standing up there looking at her take words off that page and put them in her mouth. and speak them out. And I said, how do you do that, ma'am? How do you put words in your mouth like that off that book? She says, you don't know how to read, son? I said, no, ma'am. She says, well, I'm going to teach you the rudiments of reading. So she taught me those rudiments, and I learned so well that I started piecing out the words from the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Those words used to ring in my heart, and now I was reading them my own self. And so, Miss Sophia, Miss Sofa, I called her, wanted her husband to see what I had been able to accomplish. Hugh came into the room and said, well, what can Fred do? What you want me to see him do? So I picked up the Bible and I started looking at the words. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall, and he took the book and grabbed it out of my hand with a mean scowl on his face. And he took the book and he slammed it down on the table. And he says, don't you ever let me see you doing that again. Now you get your little self out of here, in harsher terms than what I'm using right now. He said, get your little self out of here and don't ever let me see you doing that again. Don't you ever be reading any book in this household. And I heard him say to his wife, if you teach a slave how to read, it's forever going to unfit him to be a slave. If you teach him how to read, he's going to want to learn how to write, and then his mind is going to run away with itself. A slave should know only the will of his master and obey it. These are powerful things to have been said about teaching a little boy what he is and what he should not be able to do. If you teach him how to read, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. That sentence kept ringing in my head over and over, and I was determined that I was going to be unfit to be a slave. And so I learned how to read, despite the fact that you all had commanded that I not read anymore. I went out in the street and learned words from boys on the street, learned how to spell them. I memorized everything I saw. I memorized whole dictionaries at a time. When you are hungry for knowledge, you go out of your way to find it, no matter who is in the way. I've even heard of people who had no way of learning anything about reading, were able to, out of their pure sentiment of longing, have the book torn open to them by the power of the Holy Spirit. There was a woman I heard of who learned to read just from wanting to read. God showed her the words. And so my fate would change. And I was sent back to that plantation. And I was told that I was a little bit obstreperous. When you learn how to pursue knowledge, your whole being changes. People can see that you're confident, that you are full of joy and you want to learn more. But being on a slave plantation, they don't want you to learn anything. They just want you to be mean and brutish and lazy. Those are the terms that they want you to be, and those are the terms that they define you by. And so the master sent me to a place where I was going to be turned into a real slave. It was Mr. Covey's farm. And Mr. Covey beat me and beat me and beat me until blood was coming out of my head one day. And I determined that I was not going to let him beat me again. And I ran to my master's home and told him what was happening. And he said, you better get yourself back to Covey's farm, because if you don't, I'm going to beat you. And there I was between a rock and a hard place. And so what I did was I went to sleep off that beating. And a man by the name of Sandy found me. And Sandy was an African who told me that he had heard about me being beat by Mr. Covey, and he was going to give me something to stop anyone from ever beating me again. He took out a root from his pocket and he gave it to me. He put it in my hand. He convinced me that I should keep it in my right-hand pocket. And he said, go to Covey's farm. I thought Mr. Covey had been a changed man because of the root that was in my pocket, because when I saw him, he didn't put his hands on me. He just tipped his hat to me and said, good morning. It was a Sunday morning, and he was on his way to go to Sunday meeting. He was going to a revival meeting. Now, don't you think it kind of interesting how a man will beat his slaves all week and then go to church on Sunday? What is he praying for? More power to beat his slaves the rest of the week? Don't you think there's something contradictory about this image? What's wrong with this picture? Mm-hmm. So Mr. Covey came back from his revival meeting, and he was happy with the Lord. And the next morning, he told me to go hitch up the horses. I said, he's going to have me go, or him go, to get the papers to free the slaves. Because when a man is happy with the Lord, you know darn right he knows what righteousness is and what the right thing to do is. But Mr. Covey wasn't right with the Lord. I think he was right with the devil. And he come in behind me and said, now I want you to go over there and strip your clothes off because I'm going to beat you into 1 inch of your life. I said, I'm not doing that. He come at me with his ropes, and I backed up. And before he could reach me, both my arms went out like a mule kick and caught him around his neck, like so. So tight did I have his neck that he went down on his knees, and he called out, Robert! And Robert come running, and Robert said, what you want me to do? Get this man off of me. And Robert said, I wasn't hired to help you beat on nobody. And Robert ran out. Robert was one of those finicky kinds of employees. George! And George come in and says, what? Oh, I see what you doing. Help me, George. And George didn't realize that not only did I have 2 hands, but I had 2 legs and 2 knees. And as he came to put his arms around me and take me off of Mr. Covey, my knee met his chest so hard that it knocked the wind out of him. It went straight up into his chest. And George was no longer any good to help anybody. The wind had been knocked out of him. He called Caroline, and Caroline came in. And she was one of those women who could have just picked me up with her 2 fingers and threw me about 10 yards. She was so strong. But she was not in any mood to help him either. And she says, what you want me to do? Get this boy off of me. And she says, I ain't doing nothing. And she walked away as sassy as could be with her wide self. And there we were, Mr. Covey and I, for 2 hours, rolling in the dirt. And after 2 hours, he was exhausted, and he said, I would have beat you better if you hadn't resisted so much. The truth is, he hadn't beaten me at all. But Mr. Covey and I, we had a pact. We knew that he was never going to put a hand on me, and I was never going to tell anyone about his being beat by me. That was our secret confirmation with each other. And so from that time on, Mr. Covey kept his distance from me, and my fate would change. And eventually, I went back to Baltimore, and eventually, I escaped from slavery altogether. And I arrived in Boston in 1838. And then I started a family. And then I went to that famous abolitionist movement in 1841, featured by Mr. William Lloyd Garrison. And they asked me to get up and talk about my life in slavery. And as I did so, I told them that the most pernicious thing that I have ever recalled was when my grandma Betsy was put out into a little shack by herself when she was 99 years old. She was getting blind, and having worked her life all those years for that plantation, having even suckled the master's breasts when she was a little girl and when she was a teenager. She herself was a wet nurse. After all those years of service and all of her children being in service to that plantation, they put her out like she was refuse. And William Lloyd Garrison said, are we going to let this man be treated like refuse? And everyone cried, no. And are we going to let him speak out against slavery and become an abolitionist? And everyone cried, yes. You could see the tears welling in my eyes because I knew at that moment what I had to do. I had to become an abolitionist. Despite what everybody had to say about it, this is what I had to do. So I am Frederick Douglass, and I escaped from slavery. And because I am a man, I am and will forever be a pure-blooded abolitionist. So this is the story that I usually tell. But I wanted to share with you some of the features of highlights of Frederick Douglass's life, which are very multifarious. His life is filled with many speeches, many papers written, and I wanted to share with you one of the speeches that he performed in 1852. If only Santa had some helpers, right?
Would you like some help?
No. Anybody recognize this picture?
John Brown.
That's John Brown.
That's John Brown?
Yes.
John Brown?
John.
John Brown. John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. His truth is marching on. Do you realize that during the Civil War, the soldiers, the Union soldiers, used to sing that song on their way to battle? They actually used to sing that song. Now, when you see John Brown in this image, and you see the power that he emanates just in his face, you can see how he would choose to become a martyr for something as pernicious as slavery. It's written all over his body, all over his being. It's kind of like he's kind of like righteous anger. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was going to say the wrath of God.
She has a better expression, the wrath of God. That's what it looks like, doesn't it? This picture ring a bell? Harriet Beecher Stowe. The woman who wrote that famous novel, which sparked, what they say, Harriet Beecher Stowe novel sparked that compassionate, ethical, endearing melodrama which caused everyone to realize that slavery was indeed one of the most ignominious systems on the face of the earth. That they say that novels written really what changed people's hearts. Imagine that. Yeah. The true stories of lives only come to you through a novel. And of course, this is one of the famous portraits of Frederick Douglass. And the term majestic in his wrath was a sentence or a statement uttered by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the pioneer women suffragists. I forget how to pronounce that. She saw him and said he was majestic in his wrath, the way that he looked. You know, his lean, mean.
Was he a big man?
He was tall, yeah. I think he was about 6'2" or so. I think so. He was a very tall man. Yeah.
William Lloyd Garrison.
William Lloyd Garrison, the man who started the Liberator newspaper, the thing against slavery, anti-slavery. This lady knows everybody. Sojourner Truth, yeah, yeah. And she was the lady who actually challenged Frederick Douglass. In the 1850s, Frederick Douglass went from being a pacifist about slavery to being someone who was becoming much more supportive of violent insurrection against slavery. And it's interesting, and I might be getting this wrong. I think it was Sojourner Truth who was sitting in the audience. You see how stories get blended? And she piped up and said, "Is God dead?" And he said, "No, ma'am, God is not dead, but we are dying, and we cannot let that happen any longer." She was challenging him about his vociferous stance against slavery, as opposed to the passive stance.
We can see over here. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else not see this picture? So here is an excerpt from, a couple of excerpts from the 4th of July speech from 1852 that Frederick Douglass created, called "The Meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro," on July 5th, 1852. So he says, "This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. You are even now only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower upon the horizon." Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. I cannot contemplate their deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They loved their country better than their own private interests, and all will concede that it is a rare virtue that ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Isn't this beautiful language?
Yes.
Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. Now is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work and have done much of it well. You live and must die, and you must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labor of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence. Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of national justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God that both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmation, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illumined temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. Incredible narrative power that this man created. And he would hold people spellbound for hours, laughing and crying. So I just wanted to share with you some of these incredible, spectacular gifts that Frederick Douglass left us. Thank you so much. All right. So, questions, needs, observations? Yes.
The sad thing is that we have pictures of a lot of these folks in their senior years. Sojourner Truth is a little old lady. But in reality, she was over 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds. And there's a famous story where a streetcar conductor tried to throw her off the streetcar. And she stood her ground and she rode on that streetcar. Because she was such it would take 2 guys to throw her off and there was only 1 conductor. We have more recent ones of Harriet Tubman, but it's a shame when we see them and they just look like old people. We don't see them as their vibrant young selves. We do have pictures of you when you're a lot younger. And
Oh, do you?
And, well, I think that picture of Douglass isn't as common as the one in his senior years where he has that mane of gray, black hair.
Right.
But you can see the determination.
Yes, of course. All of his pictures come through with this incredible grand determination, no matter what kind of picture it is. You can see it in his eyes. Yeah. Yeah. His experience really shaped him. Yep.
I think one of the things that you note is the eloquence in which people spoke in that day, especially Frederick Douglass and people like Abraham Lincoln. And you compare it to the way that people express themselves today, especially in the political field, and there's no comparison whatsoever. None.
It's shameful. And if you even begin to try to speak with any kind of eloquence or insightful narrative order, you are totally blasted away, you know, with political diatribe. So it's like I guess you say Frederick Douglass talking to a cursing seaman on the docks.
Yeah.
You know, it's like someone who's drunk and disorderly, won't have anything to say but very slovenly things. So that's what it's like. Yeah, you're right. Any other observations about what's happening? Are you reading something, ma'am? That's
Yes, I've been reading it. It's the book. Everyone should read this. It's the 3 books in one.
oh,
3 books.
which one? Which ones are those?
Of course, the first one, The Narrative of the Life. The
Yes.
second one, My Bondage and My Freedom. And then Life in Times.
Oh, those are his 3 separate.
Yes, they're all in this. And every one should be read. You first read the first one, you just have to go into the second one, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean,
That's
this is
amazing.
Also different, his very early youthful years.
The publisher?
Something on the back.
Is it Norton Publishing?
Yes, yeah, it is, yeah,
Junior,
yeah.
one of those.
Oh yeah, this company, they do a lot of these coalescing of volumes in one. Yeah, that's great. So he did write 3 separate autobiographies: The Narrative of the Life, My Bondage, My Freedom, and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And each one of those has, it's almost like he goes back over the same material, but he adds more character to it and adds more sequences to it and more memory to it and more anecdotes until it's like you get full of a rich life that he put down on paper. So one of the things that I think really you can celebrate about Frederick Douglass is that he was a real writer. And that's something that also is part of his legacy. Not just a speaker, but a writer. I think he even wrote a couple of short stories, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Well, that speech seems to me very important. I mean, I wish we could all hear that over and over. Now,
Over and over. Yes.
given what we're living with now.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. You're right. To have that speech be kind of like a reference point for. It's like the abolitionist movement was our real first civil rights movement in this country. And as you look around the world and see the national institutions of slavery, I've heard that the family of Frederick Douglass, his current descendants, have actually created a movement
Countries.
in our present time to stop modern slavery. That this is one of their contributions to his memory. I think it's like the Frederick Douglass Institute or the Douglass Institute, something like that. Any other questions, observations?
I just think that part of the problem is people in your time were willing to listen. Going to hear speakers was a recreational activity that people enjoyed. Reading complicated text was something that people did by the fireside. Douglass today isn't really tweetable. Today's technology wouldn't allow his eloquence to come through because people want to see it like this, not like this.
So an entire experience that has a beginning and a middle and an end is something that I am pursuing in my life as a kind of career, as a teacher and as a storyteller, that yes, when I teach, there's something happening that's like a wave. It's not bits and pieces, it's a whole thing. And I bring my whole life and my whole memory to bear when I'm teaching and when I'm telling stories. And that's something we should all do more of and share with young people more, a lot more. Yes.
How do you think, or what do you think Frederick Douglass would act, do, say, if he were living today?
What do I think he would act, do, and say? Probably he would be even more vociferous in wanting to have long, unabridged speaking situations in which audiences participated for 2 or 3 hours at a time. It's like I think he would actually advocate for that. And I think that he would set up a blog on the internet and don't put up what it is you're talking about. Well, you could summarize it if you want, but make sure everyone comes together and sits together and looks into each other's eyes and tell each other stories, not just throw stuff at each other. I'm teaching a course right now in college writing, and it's an online course. So I don't even get the chance to see my students. But one of the themes that the students are working on right now is computer games and how that affects one's understanding of friendship and how friendships are made or not made in the gaming environment. Little did I realize that computer gaming is kind of like incredibly complex and incredibly diverse. There's so many games, and people have been playing them for so many years that they've become little communities. And the other aspect is media, social media, and learning to meet people either face-to-face or online, and how that affects your understanding of friendships. And one of the the students have to interview some people who are doing these things, and one of the people said that there is a disconnect between what you type and what you say. And it makes it easier for me to write and to be myself because of that disconnect. So I can see that people who are in a room with each other, who are face-to-face with each other, might have a hard time saying things to each other because they know somehow what you might, there's something going on that is alive and almost allows you to understand what a person is feeling and thinking in that moment. But if you're behind a screen or you're on a screen and you're just typing, you just let it go. There's nothing holding, there's no inhibitions. So those are some of the interesting things that I've been seeing, and these are some of the things that are important in my life as a teacher, to understand how students are working, how the internet is affecting them. So to answer your question even more, I think Frederick Douglass would be doing what I'm doing. Teaching and trying to get the oral tradition, even on the internet, more and more alive. In fact, some of my students said, I haven't seen my grades. What is the grade for this and the grade for that? I said, what I'm doing is I'm spending a lot of time looking at everything you've done and getting a good picture of you. Then I'm going to give you a comprehensive review of what I see, which means I'm also learning about how you think and how you are as a human being, which I'm not evaluating it, I'm just using it as part of my connection to you, which is how I make up the difference for not being face-to-face with students.
And how much more valuable that is than a grade for the student.
I think so.
Yes, that's right.
When I tell them about how I feel about what they're doing in their discussions and in their writing and things like that. Yeah. It's not just a grade. Yeah. It's my open-hearted feeling for what you're doing. And that's the reason I love to teach. I don't just like grading. I like getting to know my students, and their writing reveals to me a lot about them. So, I really, really appreciate your bearing with me today with this late schedule, and I hope you all had a pleasant time, and I hope to see you again. Thank you. Yes.